Everything began with a ring left in a bowl and a suitcase that hadn't been touched in 40 years. He woke up and she was gone, no note, no goodbye, not even a half-finished cup of coffee on the table. She had never missed a Sunday church service in her life, never walked out of the house without brushing her hair twice. But that morning, the wind blew through an open window, and the smell of the sea came in like a memory she couldn't ignore. She was 65 years old and tired of waiting to feel alive. What she left behind wasn't just a man, it was a version of herself she didn't recognize anymore. Everyone thought she'd lost her mind, but they didn't know what she'd found. Now, she returns to the same place every year, alone, by choice. And if you think you know why she left, think again. Because the truth, the real truth, didn't come until years later, and it changed everything she thought she knew about love. But before we begin, write in the comments where you're from. I'm curious to see how far these stories can travel. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new captivating tales. Let's begin. Write in the comments where you're from, let's see how far these stories can spread. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new exciting stories. See you soon. The morning she disappeared, there was no storm, no shouting, no slammed doors or scribbled notes, just an empty bed and a chair facing east. The kettle had boiled itself dry, hissing like an old snake beneath the silence, and the cat sat motionless by the window, tail flicking, eyes fixed on something that wasn't there. On the small table by the door, her wedding ring lay in a chipped porcelain dish, next to a bus schedule with one route circled in red. Her husband would later swear to the police that she hadn't packed a thing, that all her clothes still hung in the closet, that her toothbrush was dry and her shoes were all there, untouched. But her passport was gone, and the only suitcase missing was the little one she'd once joked about using to run away to France. They searched the nearby towns, the bus station, the hospital, even the library where she used to lose herself in novels about women who vanished and found themselves in foreign places. But there were no leads, no signs of foul play, and no goodbye, just that ring, the schedule, and the cat that wouldn't leave the window for 3 days straight. The neighbors whispered in polite confusion, as they always did in towns like that, where life was supposed to stay quiet and respectable, even when your heart was being torn out. And while everyone seemed puzzled by the suddenness of her leaving, no one really seemed surprised, as though some part of them always knew she wasn't made for staying still. The police closed the file after 6 months, calling it a voluntary disappearance, and by then the house was sold, the garden overgrown, and the cat rehomed by a woman down the street. Now, before we go any further, let me take you back to the beginning, not the morning she vanished, but the evening 3 days before, when everything quietly began to unravel. It was the kind of twilight that turns the sky into wet velvet, purple and gold smeared across the horizon like a bruise healing slow, and she sat alone on the back porch with a single glass of wine. 65 years old to the day, and the cake sat untouched on the kitchen counter, its cheap frosting spelling her name wrong, even though she'd reminded him twice that morning. There were no phone calls, no children, no clumsy songs or candles blown out to laughter, just the distant sound of traffic and the soft rustle of the wind through the old pear tree. He'd gone to bed early again, muttering something about work in the morning, even though he'd retired 3 years ago and spent most days falling asleep to the History Channel. She sat there, not angry, not even particularly sad, just still, in that way people get when they've grown tired of waiting for life to knock again. And then, in the same drawer where she kept spare batteries and light bulbs, she found the magazine with the creased page she'd marked almost 15 years earlier. It showed a place called Wren Harbor, a town so small it barely touched the coast, a cluster of faded houses and wind-shaped cliffs where the seagulls flew low and loud. She remembered the article calling it a place for the soul to exhale, and back then she'd underlined those words with a pink marker, even though she hadn't owned a pink marker in decades. Without thinking, without ceremony, she stood, poured the wine down the sink, and began folding clothes she hadn't worn in years, not dresses for church or dinners out, but soft cotton things meant only for comfort. By midnight, the suitcase sat by the front door, and the email confirming her one-way ticket blinked on the screen of the old laptop she rarely touched anymore. She didn't leave a letter because she didn't owe anyone an explanation, not after 42 years of cooking meals she didn't eat and smiling through conversations she didn't believe in. She didn't wake him because she didn't want the sound of his voice to make her doubt, and she didn't cry because, frankly, she didn't see the point anymore. Instead, she stepped out quietly, locking the door behind her, and began the long walk to the corner where the 5:10 bus waited like an old friend who'd finally shown up. The driver didn't ask questions, didn't even glance twice, and when she handed him the ticket, her hand was steady, the first time it had been in years. That first night in Wren Harbor, she stayed at a hotel that smelled like cedar and old wool, with a lobby full of faded photographs from decades past. She didn't go down to dinner, not because she wasn't hungry, but because she wasn't ready to sit in a room full of strangers and explain who she was. Instead, she watched the ocean through a narrow window and listened to the waves whisper secrets she hadn't heard since she was a child. She slept like someone who'd spent years pretending to be someone else and finally took off the costume, not caring where it fell or who saw. The next morning, she walked along the boardwalk just after sunrise, the gulls screeching overhead and the salt air catching in her throat like a song she almost remembered. It was her second night when she forced herself to enter the hotel restaurant, her heart hammering against her ribs like a bird trapped inside a shoebox. She asked for a table for one and kept her hands folded in her lap, trying not to look around too much or too little, unsure of the rules now. And then the waitress, no older than 22, leaned in and said, with no hint of sarcasm or pity, "You're the most confident woman I've ever seen." She didn't laugh, didn't cry, didn't say thank you, she just nodded, as though someone had finally handed her a mirror she recognized. Later, lying in bed with her journal open, she wrote the words slowly, carefully, like a prayer, "Maybe confidence isn't loud. Maybe it's just the choice to begin again." By the third day, something had shifted, not dramatically, not like a movie or a song, but gently, like the tide rolling back after a long silence. She laughed, truly laughed, while watching the seagulls dive and squawk, her bare feet sinking into the wet sand like roots finding home. She bought a light blue dress from a shop with no price tags, just for the way it moved when she spun in front of the mirror. She didn't think about who might see her in it or what they'd say, she wore it because she liked the way it felt on her skin. And that night, she wrote again in her journal, this time without hesitation, "I feel more myself with every hour that passes." But just as the comfort began to settle in, like a blanket wrapped around her bones, she saw something, or someone, at the edge of the beach, standing too still, too familiar. She didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't dare blink, because in that shadow, beneath that wide-brimmed hat, was a shape that didn't belong in Wren Harbor. Was it a mistake, some passing resemblance in the fog? Or had something followed her, tracked her, found her across all this distance and silence? And if she had run away to start over, who, or what, had finally come looking for her? Yes, something, or someone, had come looking for her, though in that trembling moment beneath the gathering dusk, she couldn't yet tell which. The air had turned damp and heavy, thick with the scent of brine and pine, and every sound on the beach felt louder than it should have been. She stood motionless, one hand gently resting against the wind-sanded railing of the boardwalk, her eyes fixed on the figure standing not 20 paces away. It was tall, slightly hunched, cloaked in a long coat that hung loose at the shoulders, the wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow across what she couldn't, or wouldn't, yet see. A breeze lifted a corner of the coat, revealing a flash of dark denim and boots caked with wet sand, and for a heartbeat, she thought she smelled cigarette smoke. She hadn't touched a cigarette since the year Nixon resigned, but the scent brought it all back, the porch swing in August, the hum of cicadas, and the memory of a man who once leaned close to light her cigarette with a trembling hand. The figure didn't move, didn't raise a hand or step forward, but neither did it turn away, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being studied, not watched with curiosity, but evaluated with something more personal. When the wind shifted, the shape seemed to blur slightly, like a memory not fully developed, and in that moment, she did something she hadn't done in a very long time, she turned around and walked away without apology. Her footsteps echoed against the old planks of the boardwalk, her breath tight in her chest, the hem of her dress clinging to her legs with each hurried step. By the time she reached the edge of the inn's porch, the sun had vanished behind the hills, and the first stars blinked awake, indifferent to her rising panic. Inside the inn's lobby, the lamps had already been lit, casting warm pools of amber light across the weathered floorboards and the faded rug with its frayed edges curling like old letters. She didn't go up to her room right away. Instead, she sat down in the wicker chair near the front window and pretended to read the same paragraph in her book 3 times. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the pages, but not from fear exactly. It was more the shock of having the past reach out and tap her shoulder when she thought she'd outrun it. There had always been moments in her life where time seemed to hesitate, like a breath held too long, and this was one of them, a quiet pause where the future felt uncertain and the past too close. And in that stillness, her mind returned to the dinner 2 nights ago, to the waitress with the soft eyes and a compliment that had cracked something open inside her. She remembered how her fork had trembled slightly as she brought it to her lips, how she'd looked around the room and seen no one else who looked lost, only couples and families, all in conversation, all with purpose. Yet somehow, the waitress had seen through all that, seen past the lines on her face and the silver in her hair and recognized something she hadn't known she was showing. It had taken years, decades, really, to grow so quiet that people stopped asking how she was, but it had taken only a few minutes for a stranger to look at her and truly see. And that, she realized now, had been the moment her life had started again, though at the time she'd thought it was just another awkward dinner in a long line of lonely meals. Still staring at the page she hadn't read, she finally stood, thanked the night clerk with a polite nod, and took the stairs slowly, as though unsure what waited at the top. In her room, the journal lay open where she'd left it, the last words written in looping, careful cursive that had started to resemble her mother's handwriting in her later years. She sat on the edge of the bed, letting the silence settle again before picking up the pen, the weight of it familiar and strangely comforting in her hand. Tonight, she wrote only one sentence, steady and slow, as though speaking aloud to someone she hadn't yet decided to forgive. I saw him, or something like him, and I'm not sure if I should run or stay. She closed the book gently, as one might close a photo album containing too many ghosts, and turned off the light, the moonlight slipping through the curtains like an old lover who still knew the way in. Sleep came in waves, not deep enough to rest, not light enough to rise, and in that hazy drift, she dreamed of white rooms, suitcases packed by other hands, and voices she hadn't heard since childhood. Morning brought the smell of coffee from downstairs and the sound of gulls arguing over scraps outside the kitchen, and she welcomed both like old neighbors who never stopped dropping by. She dressed slowly, choosing a soft blouse that smelled faintly of cedar and sun, and tied her hair back with a ribbon she hadn't worn since her 40th birthday, when her sister had brought over lemon cake and news of divorce. The town outside seemed unchanged, still quiet and weather-worn, with its rusted bikes leaning against fences and mailboxes shaped like lighthouses, and for a moment, she wondered if she had imagined it all. But then she stepped out onto the porch and saw the boot prints in the sand, deep and recent, leading from the water's edge to the boardwalk and nowhere else. And though she told herself not to, she followed them, one careful step after another, until they ended near the rocks where the fog always hung low and thick like a veil. There was no one there now, just the sea murmuring its secrets and the sound of wind threading through the grass like whispers meant for someone else. She stood there a long time, arms wrapped around herself like armor, and tried to remember when she had first learned that sometimes absence felt more haunting than presence. And then, without quite meaning to, she said aloud, softly, but clearly, "You don't get to follow me here." The words vanished into the air, claimed by the wind, and she stood a little straighter after they left her lips, as if some small piece of her had been waiting for that moment. But as she turned to leave, she saw something glinting in the sand, half buried, dull with salt, but unmistakable, a silver lighter engraved with the initial CH. Her breath caught, the way it does when an old photograph falls out of a book you thought you'd already read front to back. She bent down, fingers brushing sand from the surface, and when she held it to the light, she felt her knees weaken in a way that had nothing to do with age. It was the same lighter he'd carried for decades, the one he refused to part with, even when he stopped smoking, because it was a gift from his brother who died in Nam. And suddenly the wind felt colder, the sky more watchful, and her heart, that stubborn, resilient heart, beat louder than it had in years. She slipped the lighter into her pocket, its weight heavier than metal, and walked slowly back to the inn, not sure what she'd say, or to whom, but knowing silence would no longer be enough. That night, she didn't write in her journal, didn't open her book or turn on the television, she simply sat, listening to the sea and trying to decide whether ghosts could bleed. And as the clock ticked past midnight, she whispered one question aloud to the dark, her voice low, steady, and aching with memory: if he's really here, what does he want from me now? And when the answer came the next morning, it wasn't in words, it was in the envelope slid under her door. The envelope lay there like a dropped glove, plain and unmarked except for the single, neat line of her name in block letters. She stared at it for what felt like hours, the corners of her mind folding inward, trying to make sense of how it had gotten there. No one had knocked, no floorboard creaked, and the clerk downstairs had seen nothing, heard nothing, just whistled quietly to the sound of the morning radio. It wasn't sealed, just tucked closed, the kind of fold you make when something's been opened and read more than once already, carefully, intentionally, maybe even reluctantly. Her fingers hovered over the flap, the weight of years settling onto her shoulders like a familiar winter coat pulled from the attic too soon. She carried it to the little table by the window, the one she'd used each morning for coffee and quiet, watching the gulls wheel above the crashing surf. With her other hand, she reached for her reading glasses, though she didn't need them to know what the paper inside might carry, not in words, but in memory. There was something different about the handwriting, not the letters themselves, but the pressure, the way each one leaned slightly left, like someone walking into wind. It read, "You left without a word, but I knew where you'd go. You always talked about this place like it was a secret only you could understand. I won't stay long. I just need one afternoon. If you're willing, meet me where the tide leaves the driftwood behind." There was no signature, no name, but she didn't need one, because only one person in the world had ever told her that driftwood reminded them of her strength. She folded the note once more out of habit than decision, and placed it beneath her coffee cup like a paperweight over a dream she wasn't ready to forget. Her fingers trembled slightly as she buttered her toast, each movement precise, mechanical, the body moving even when the mind drifts far beyond the room it sits in. The waitress, a different one this morning, older, quieter, smiled politely but didn't ask questions, sensing perhaps that this guest wasn't made for small talk today. Outside, the fog had begun to lift, and the sea was throwing sunlight back in waves, as if challenging the day to keep secrets any longer. She ate slowly, methodically, not out of hunger but because routine has a way of anchoring us when everything else starts to shift beneath our feet. By late morning, she was walking again, not fast, not with purpose, but with that careful hesitation of someone measuring their courage against each step forward. The beach stretched wide and empty, save for a few fishermen casting lines too far, and children chasing dogs that barked at nothing. She followed the curve of the sand past the jetty, to the place where the driftwood gathered in tangled nests, bones of trees lost to time and tide. There was a bench tucked back against the dune grass, half-rotted and gray, the kind built decades ago when towns still expected their visitors to sit and stay a while. She sat there, folding her hands in her lap, the wind pushing hair across her cheek as if nature itself couldn't decide whether to comfort her or not. He arrived the way men like him always did, without sound, without spectacle, just a presence behind her, a shifting in the air that changed everything. She didn't turn around right away, choosing instead to look out at the waves as they rolled in steady and endless, like regret wearing a salt-stained crown. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, deliberate, the way you speak when you've rehearsed the words in your head more times than you'll admit. "I should have burned that magazine," she said, almost smiling, "but I kept it under the sink for 15 years, next to the bleach and the birthday candles." His voice, when it came, was softer than she remembered, like gravel smoothed by years of silence. "I looked in the wrong places first. Always did have poor aim." She turned then, slow and unhurried, and there he was, older, thinner, face lined like a road map, eyes still that same shade of storm warning blue. He didn't smile, didn't reach out, just stood there with his hands shoved in his coat pockets like a boy caught sneaking a cigarette behind the barn. They looked at each other for a long time, the way people do when too much has passed and yet somehow, not enough has been said. Finally, she patted the bench beside her, not warmly but not unkindly, and he sat down like a man settling into a pew at a funeral. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was thick and heavy, full of names unsaid and years unlived. "You followed me," she said, more fact than accusation, and he nodded, eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the horizon. "I wasn't sure if I'd find you," he answered, "but I knew you weren't gone." "Not really. You were just, finally living." That hit harder than she expected, and she looked away, blinking at the sudden sting in her eyes, surprised by how quickly old wounds remembered how to ache. "I needed to go," she said after a long pause, "before I disappeared inside the life we built out of obligations and forgetting." He didn't argue, didn't defend himself, just sighed, a long, tired sound, and pulled the silver lighter from his pocket, holding it out with an unspoken question. She didn't take it, just stared at it, remembering the way he used to flick it open with one hand, like a magician revealing a trick he never explained. "That lighter belonged to your brother," she said quietly, "and you promised me once you'd never let it go unless something mattered more." He nodded again, thumb brushing the metal's edge, the lines around his mouth deepening like fault lines carved from too many years of not speaking truth. "I thought it would bring you back," he murmured, "or at least remind you of who I used to be before I forgot myself." She closed her eyes, not from weariness but from the weight of too many truths arriving all at once, like letters delivered 20 years too late. They sat in silence again, not as enemies or even lovers, but as something quieter, witnesses to the lives they almost lived. The tide began to rise, creeping closer to the driftwood, and the sun climbed higher, burning the mist away in long, slow strokes. "I don't hate you," she said finally, her voice steadier now, "but I don't think I can go back to that house, to that name." "I didn't come to take you back," he said, and this time when he looked at her, it wasn't with longing but something older, acceptance, maybe even admiration. "I came to tell you something," he added, voice low, and suddenly his hands trembled just enough for her to notice, and the bench felt colder beneath them both. She turned toward him, eyebrows drawn, a question forming in her throat, but he held up a hand before she could speak. "It's about your sister," he said, and at that, her breath caught, heart stuttering in her chest the way it had only once before, the day of the phone call that never came. "She told me something, back before she left town for good, something you were never supposed to know. But I think it's time you heard it." The ocean roared behind them, as if trying to drown out the moment, but the words hung there between them like a bell that had already been rung. And in that instant, she knew whatever came next would change not only why she left, but who she had always believed herself to be. What secret had her sister carried all those years, and why had he waited until now to speak it aloud? The moment the question left her lips, spoken more in breath than voice, the world around them seemed to hush, as if even the wind paused to listen. He didn't look at her when he answered, his gaze fixed on a spot where the surf met the rocks, like a man searching for the exact place he lost something he once loved. "There are some things," he began, slowly, deliberately, the way older men sometimes speak when they're scared they'll lose their way through the telling, "that don't belong to the past, no matter how long you try to keep them there." She didn't respond, not yet, just folded her hands tightly in her lap and let her body lean slightly forward, the way she used to when she braced for bad news. And when he finally spoke again, his voice had dropped low, not because of secrecy, but because some words simply come out quieter when they're carrying too much weight. "It was the summer after your mother passed," he said, and already her mind was swimming with images, the cracked linoleum floor, the smell of peaches overripe in the heat, the silence so loud it rang. "Your sister came to me one night, crying so hard she could barely talk, and she made me swear not to tell you," he continued, his voice splintering like dry wood. He paused then, rubbing the lighter between his palms like a stone, as if trying to find warmth in the thing that once brought fire. "She told me something that night that didn't make sense at first, and honestly, I didn't want it to," he admitted, looking down at his hands like a man waiting for a verdict. But the truth doesn't care if it fits the life you've built, it just waits, patient as the tide, until the moment you can't pretend anymore. Her breath caught in her throat, her eyes narrowing as though they could sharpen the memory, force it into something less slippery, more whole. Just say it, she whispered, but the strength in her voice had cracked, revealing the girl who once sat in the hallway outside a closed bedroom door, listening for sounds that never came. He nodded, slow and reluctant, then finally let the words tumble out the way they always do when the dam breaks. Your sister said your father wasn't your father, he said, and the sentence landed like thunder muffled by snow, not loud, but heavy, and everywhere all at once. She said your mother had a moment, just one, with someone else, and that you were born with his eyes, not hers, not your father's. The sand beneath her feet felt suddenly less stable, like the ground itself was unsure of what to do with such an old, buried truth finally unearthed. She turned her face away from him, staring at the distant horizon, trying to remember all the moments that hadn't made sense, all the silences that now whispered something different. There had been arguments in the kitchen when they thought she was asleep, sharp words softened behind closed doors, her father's hand on her shoulder always slightly more cautious than warm. And her mother, oh, her mother, had always watched her with an expression that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite pride, but something in between, like fear trying to wear love's face. I don't understand why she never told me, she murmured, more to the sea than to him, her voice almost lost to the wind that had begun to pick up again. He looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing something in her for the first time, not just age or sorrow, but a fracture that had always been there, just better hidden before. She said she was protecting you, he said gently, or maybe protecting herself, or maybe it was just easier to pretend the world made sense. Her hands tightened on the bench edge, white-knuckled, as the familiar ache of being left out of one's own story began to rise again in her chest. All these years she had searched for something, not in places, but in feelings, in books, in conversations that circled but never landed, and now she saw why nothing had ever quite fit. Even her laughter, when it came, had always felt borrowed, like trying on someone else's coat that never sat right on her shoulders. I used to wonder why I never looked like either of them, she said, not needing him to answer, but I figured that's how family worked, it wasn't about faces, it was about names. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to smooth the edges of this jagged moment, just waited with the stillness of someone who's carried a secret longer than it ever should have been carried. Did you know him? She asked finally, and he nodded once, that old pain flickering again in the lines around his mouth. Briefly, he said, before he left town for good. A quiet man. Thoughtful. Said very little. But he lit up when he saw your mother, like watching someone wake up after a long sleep. She didn't cry then, she'd already wept enough in her life over things she couldn't name, but the salt on her cheeks wasn't all from the sea spray anymore. They sat together for a long while after that, saying nothing, letting the waves do the talking, the driftwood shifting slowly as the tide inched up around their feet. Somewhere, far down the beach, a dog barked at something only it could see, and a boy chased it, laughing, his voice high and unbroken. She turned to the man beside her, the one she had once loved, and maybe, in some way, still did, and asked, why now? Why tell me this after all these years? His answer came slower this time, softer, like a man making peace with a wound he can't stitch closed. Because she's gone now, he said, and she can't stop me from doing what I should have done the moment she left town. That struck deeper than she expected, and suddenly she saw it, not just his sorrow, but his own buried guilt, the kind men carried in silence until it hardened into stone. He had known all this time, loved her all this time, and yet kept this truth at bay like a storm he couldn't afford to face. I didn't want to lose you, he added, and I knew if I told you back then, you'd leave, and not just the house. She stood then, slow but certain, brushing sand from her skirt as she looked out once more to the sea, which had always carried more truth than people ever cared to admit. You were right, she said, not bitterly, not cruelly, just honestly, as someone who has walked a long road back to herself. I would have left, she added, eyes narrowed toward the place where the sun now hovered just above the horizon, and in that light, she looked more like herself than she had in years. He stood too, brushing off his coat, tucking the lighter back into his pocket like a chapter that no longer needed reading. "Then why stay now?" he asked, his voice unsteady, not with fear but with a hope he didn't quite know how to carry. She didn't answer at first, just took a few steps forward into the surf, letting the water soak her shoes, the chill grounding her in the moment. And then, over her shoulder, without looking back, she said, "Because maybe I'm finally ready to meet the woman I was never allowed to become." That night, back in her room, she opened her journal again, the pen moving slower now, each word written with the care of someone discovering her name all over again. But just before she could close it, just before the day could settle into memory, there came a knock at the door, soft, steady, and unmistakably familiar. She opened it to find a woman standing there, older, hair wild with silver, eyes that looked too much like her own, holding something wrapped in cloth. "I think," the woman said, voice low and unsure, "we might share more than just blood." But who was this woman, and what truth had she brought that even the beach hadn't whispered yet? The woman at the door stood very still, as though uncertain whether to speak again or turn and vanish into the soft shadows of the hallway. In her hands, she held the cloth-wrapped object as if it were something fragile and sacred, something not meant to be carried for long by anyone alone. The fabric was worn and faintly floral, the kind used for baby blankets in the late 50s, its edges yellowed and fraying where time had tugged too hard. Her voice, that first time, had sounded both hesitant and sure, like someone who'd practiced a greeting dozens of times only to find the real moment far more complicated. And the woman who'd run from her home, her name, her history, the woman who now lived in a town she'd once underlined in a magazine, simply stepped aside and let her in. They sat without speaking for a long while, the stranger carefully placing the bundle on the desk between them, never once removing her hand from it. Through the open window, the night air drifted in, cool and laced with salt, carrying the sound of the waves like a lullaby too old to name. It was not until the kettle on the bedside table clicked itself off that she moved, standing slowly to pour 2 mugs of tea that neither of them touched. The silence between them wasn't awkward, not the silence of strangers, but the thick, pregnant pause of 2 stories bending slowly toward one another, finally ready to overlap. "I didn't know you existed until 3 months ago," the woman finally said, her voice like gravel softened in a rainstorm, and the listener simply nodded, as though her body already understood what her mind could not. "She never told me either," the woman continued, eyes locked on the cloth as if afraid it might vanish should she blink too long. "I found the letter in a cedar chest when she passed, folded between birth records and a pressed blue ribbon that didn't have a name." At that, the woman from Wren Harbor leaned forward, her breath slow, measured, the beat of her heart suddenly louder than any seagull cry or crashing tide. "And you are?" she asked, and it wasn't suspicion in her voice, nor hope, just a quiet curiosity, the kind that grows inside people who've lived too long without answers. "My name is Margaret and Delaney," the woman said softly, and the moment the words settled into the air, the wind outside shifted, as if time itself exhaled. She blinked once, twice, and then again, not from disbelief, but because the name stirred something that had lived too long in the shadow of forgetting. "Delaney," she repeated, her hand trembling slightly as it rose to her chest, resting on the place where her locket usually lay before she left it behind. "That was my mother's maiden name," she said, more to herself than to the room, and in that instant, the story she had lived began to fold in on itself. Margaret nodded, removing her hand from the cloth and gently peeling it back, revealing a framed photograph, aged and cracked, of a woman standing in front of a willow tree, her eyes unmistakable. "Her name was Evelyn," Margaret said, "and she was my mother too, but no one in our family ever knew she had another child." The photograph shimmered in the dim light, and for a long moment, neither woman moved, as though some old thread between them had just pulled taut and begun to hum. "She was 17 when she had you," Margaret continued, voice steady now, the years of doubt and searching having long since burned off into this moment. "She was sent away to stay with a distant cousin in Virginia, one of those homes where no one used last names and the nurses wore starched smiles. The woman across from her, who once thought she'd known her own story from beginning to end, found herself sitting inside a plot twist 50 years in the making. They told her the baby would be adopted by a family in the next town, Margaret said, but she never got their name, and by the time she came home, it was like it had never happened. The room felt too small suddenly, the walls too close, the air too thin, and yet, everything in her life now felt wider, stranger, and more honest than it ever had before. She stood and walked to the window, pressing her hand lightly against the frame, needing to feel something solid beneath her fingers while the rest of her was swept away. I spent years trying to understand why I never fit in, she said quietly, her voice a thread unraveling, why I always felt like a borrowed page in someone else's book. And now, she whispered, turning to face the woman who looked too much like her in the ways that counted, now I know whose chapter one really belonged to. Margaret smiled then, small, weary, but real, and opened the satchel beside her, pulling out something wrapped tightly in tissue and tied with a faded green ribbon. This is the rest, she said, placing the package on the table, letters Evelyn wrote after she returned home, letters to the child she never got to hold again. And as the ribbon fell away and the paper parted, the letters spilled out like leaves pressed in memory, delicate, intimate, each one a small offering from a mother to her daughter. Together, they read them, two women in a seaside room, hands trembling, hearts aching, eyes brimming not just with tears, but with something long missing, recognition. Each letter told not just of love, but of longing, of guilt worn threadbare, of birthdays missed, of lullabies never sung, of names whispered to no one in particular at dusk. And by the time the last envelope lay empty on the table, neither woman needed to ask what came next, because sometimes, truth doesn't demand action, only acknowledgement. Later that night, after Margaret had gone, promising to return the next day with more papers, photographs, and a story of her own waiting to be told, she sat alone by the window again. Outside, the moon hung low over the ocean, and the sound of the tide was no longer a stranger's voice but a hymn she now recognized as her own. She opened her journal for the last time that trip, her handwriting slower than before but finally without hesitation, without the filter of pretending to be who she wasn't. I wasn't running away from a life, I was running toward a truth that had been chasing me longer than I knew. And now, with her face still fresh in my memory and our mother's voice between us, I finally know who I've been all this time. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, she walked barefoot down to the beach again, the same spot where the driftwood gathered like weary travelers who'd finally found home. She carried only one thing, a photograph now framed in silver, Evelyn beneath the willow, looking out not with shame, but with hope. And there, kneeling beside the tide, she whispered a thank you into the wind, not just to her mother, but to the girl she'd been, and the woman she'd now become. Because in the end, it had never been about escape or reinvention, it had always been about return, not to a place, but to a name whispered only once and buried deep. And for the first time in her life, she said it aloud, softly, but clearly, not the name she'd carried, but the one she'd never been given. Evelyn had. Write in the comments where you're from, let's see how far these stories can spread. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new exciting stories. See you soon.